So far in working with factor vectors, we've assumed that the data that we've received came as labeled categories instead of numerical categories. So in the previous videos, we've discussed a Likert type item where we asked students their level of enjoyment of the musical class, and then we have their responses. So we created an object called enjoyment, and we assigned to it a character vector with each of their responses as characters. Most likely, if you pull a data set from a website or you've received some type of data to analyze, there's a good chance you're going to receive that data as numerical data. So the data will come back something similar to this, where it's just numerical data that represents the labeled categories. So what you notice here is that if I just run this one line of code, the vector comes back as a numeric vector with 10 responses labeled 4, 3, 3, 1, 2, 3, 3, 4, 2, 3. What we need to do is explicitly coerce this enjoyment vector, which is currently a numerical vector, into a factor vector. And then we're going to have to assign the labels to the particular levels. Lastly, we're going to have to assign order to the levels. So that way we have an ordered factor vector that's labeled appropriately. So the first thing that we need to do is explicitly coerce the enjoyment vector, which is currently a numeric vector, into a factor vector. So in order to do that, we can create a new object. I'll call it enjoyment underscore factor. And then we can use the asFactor function. And inside the function, we can pass through it the argument of the original vector. I'll run the code. And we see that we have the new factor vector. It tells us that it's a factor with 4 levels, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, and the next thing that we need to do is we need to assign the labels to the levels. Okay, so we can create another new object. I'll call it enjoyment factor named. And in here, because we're working with a factor, we can use the factor function. Now this is different than the asFactor function. So with the factor function, we need to first identify the factor vector that we want to name, and then we give it its labels. So the vector that we're working with is the enjoyment factor vector. I'm going to use a comma to separate the first argument from the second argument. And we don't have to do this to run the code, but generally it's good practice that when you're working with multiple arguments, to put each argument on a separate line. That makes it a little bit easier to read the specific steps that you used. So I'm going to hit return, and then here I'm going to use the labels argument, labels equals, and then we need to concatenate the names of the labels. So yes, here we're going to be using a function within an argument, or even broader, a function within a function. So I'm going to use the concatenate, and then we're going to add the names of the labels from least to most. So the first label will be strongly disagree. The next will be disagree, agree, and strongly agree. I'll run the code, and then we'll notice here that we have a new vector. It's enjoyment factor named. It's a factor vector with 4 levels, strongly disagree. So we can come down here to the code just to check it. We can hit enjoyment factor named, and then it's changed from the numerics to the labels. And so the last thing that we do here is we have to assign order to the levels. We have to indicate to R that there is a relationship between the categories and it is ordinal. So to do that, we can create a new object, and we'll add ordered. We'll tag it onto the end here. And once again, we can use the factor function because we're working with a factor. We need to pull up the vector that we're going to work on. So enjoyment factor named. I'll add a comma. And then the next argument, I'll say ordered equals true. I'll run the code. And we now have a new named and ordered factor vector with 4 levels. We can come down to the console and type in the new vector to see what it looks like. We see the labels attached to the responses, and for the levels we have the less than operations, which indicates that there is an order, and we see that the levels are in the proper order which we would want.